Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. Great to be here with you, Kristo, and with all of you. Fantastic to be back here. I think I was here 2 years ago with Tavet, actually not here, but in Spain 2 years ago. So it's great to get an update on TransferWise and all the success. I guess I think people are probably familiar, hopefully very familiar with TransferWise, but you're the leading global digital marketplace for FX payments. Maybe they come up with a better phrase over time. Since we just had Joe from Ethereum on, maybe a first question just to link to what's going on in crypto. What are your views on crypto? Why aren't you trading his currency on your platform, and how are you kind of thinking about that strategically?
It's a good question. We get this a lot, like how can you do TransferWise without crypto? And we can. So I'm actually a big fan of Ethereum. Like 2 years ago, I was coding on weekends on Ethereum myself, on hobby projects. And I think they're clever, like really, really important things that will come on the blockchain. We just haven't found anything that we could do faster or smarter or cheaper for our users with crypto. So it looks like the old databases and the usual internet works as well.
Okay, good. I guess maybe we'll hear more on that later. No, I'm not implying anything. So, going back to some of your recent announcements, I guess last week at a smaller conference somewhere else, you announced this BPCE deal where you are now enabling FX transfers for the second largest bank in France, all of their customers, and effectively that bank has asked you to handle the FX payment process for them. Can you give us a little bit of perspective on that deal? Do you see that as a trend? Do you see other banks coming, in line to use you for that same purpose? And why would they partner with you? What are the advantages of working with you?
So actually, to answer that, let me give you a little story, which was, I think, in 2015, and it was in a small country called Hungary in Eastern Europe. We were just in the process of adding a lot more new currencies on TransferWise, and one of the countries that we added was Hungary and Hungarian forint. And all of a sudden, about 2015, we saw there's lots of new people in Hungary joining TransferWise, and it was like more than usual. We started looking into this and asking why, how did you hear about us? And they said, well, our bank recommended to use TransferWise. So, okay, that's interesting. And we explored a bit more, and turned out that there was a Hungarian bank, AXA Bank, who had figured out that it's so expensive for them to do international payments themselves. It was clumsy, and then once they did it, they put on all this effort trying to do it well, but relying on the old correspondent networks they had, actually users were still pretty unhappy. So they thought that's a bit awkward, because we ourselves, the bank managers, were using TransferWise, so why don't we recommend this to our users as well? And that's what they started doing, so without even asking us. So we thought that's pretty interesting. Then time forward, when new banks started to emerge in Europe, number 26 was one of the first ones that did it really well, and they, the same way, thought, hey, would we really integrate this SWIFT network and try to get Goldman or Deutsche or someone else to do our, Goldman doesn't do this actually, but Deutsche to do your,
thankfully,
your kind of back-end correspondent banking? That no, we just integrate the TransferWise API, because most of our users would be using TransferWise anyway. So kind of then taking it forward to this announcement last week, this is very exciting for us, because having the second largest bank in France, being a big traditional bank who's now going to be transparent with their users, so using the real mid-market exchange rate, not putting any fees into the exchange rate. And actually, by using TransferWise, they will become 3 times cheaper than the rest of the banks in France. So it's actually going to be a no-brainer for anyone in France who's doing something internationally or sharing their life between two currency zones, if they're looking for a bank, I mean, it's going to be a really straightforward choice for them.
Maybe just digging into that a little bit, and also you mentioned Goldman, but thinking about how banks are organized as siloed businesses where technology is really spent within individual businesses within those very large banks and not horizontal across multiple different services. I mean, is that the key reason why you can do this so much more cost effectively than a traditional bank? Is there something to learn from that for the traditional banks? And then a follow-on question, if you can, on are there any banks out there that are showing some promise in kind of rebuilding the way they work to create platforms like yourself?
This is a very good question, and what we find is, and maybe that's useful for other tech companies here, is that given, as you said, banks are so multi-product, they've been very universal. They don't really have product P&Ls, or they're not. It's not very easy for them to figure out how much that international payment costs or card processing costs for them, because it's kind of lumped into branches and lumped into massive IT cost, which cannot be very well attributed, or at least it takes an effort. And certainly we find that once the banks kind of start laser focusing on, these are our product, this is a product that we're analyzing, and if we can create the P&L, the profit and loss statement, basically for a product, then suddenly they find that, oops, some of these things that looked quite high on the revenue side are actually also very expensive on the cost side. And then there's another thing that we're now seeing happening more, on what you asked, was banks used to be generally quite dismissive in a good way towards financial tech companies, and I think now they're starting to realize that in like fintech there are two types of competitors, if you like. There are people who are building new banks, and they're actually doing pretty well. I mean, well enough to be noticed, especially in Europe, and they're going to take the bank's customers, or at least they aim to. And then there are others who don't really build an alternative to a bank, but help bank users do something better, whether that's processing payments like Adyen, or taking payments like iZettle, or giving out loans like Funding Circle or Betterment or TransferWise. And they're realizing that actually, if we really want to compete with these neobanks, we need to do something clever with these other guys that people seem to really like, and that's how we kind of come out of the water in the kind of user experience side.
And so as part of that, you've now partnered with N26. I guess that's been a year or so. Do you? I guess one way to go about it would be to continue to partner with the neobanks, be the service layer effectively for those companies. Do you ever see yourself going into being more like a neobank? Do you feel like there's a focus for you on a certain service or product that's important, or how do you evaluate those pros and cons?
When Amazon writes this annual letter that it's day one, we should write an annual letter that it's the first minute, because we're still scratching the surface. We're a large company. We're more than 1,000 people. We're moving 3 billion euros every month, and that's still very little compared to what's flowing through banks. Therefore, I think part of the way how we bring the cost savings and faster transfers to larger groups of people is through these bank partnerships. Because actually, if you use the Number 26 app or the BPC app, you'll find that it's actually super convenient to use TransferWise from within that app. It's perhaps a better user experience than using TransferWise on its own, because you don't have to switch between apps so between your bank and your money saving side. But then again, there are people who have very specific cross-border needs, freelancers who invoice abroad, and we've launched this thing called a borderless account about a year ago actually, probably to the day, and it has now had more than £1 billion worth of deposits from people who don't have a banking need just in one country, but who bank in multiple countries and who maybe don't think that they're necessarily only focused in Ireland or only focused in the UK, but trade globally.
Is that the first product in the series of many? Will you continue to evolve the number of product sets? How far will you go?
For us, the focus is like, what is it? Where is it that the traditional services or banks are failing in cross-border? So banks have generally been, and historically been super local. We don't quite realize this. It's one of the industries that has been incredibly local, domestic. Apart from maybe Citibank and HSBC, which have global brands, but often it's just cobbled together domestic units, and it's really hard for them to have a global stack. And therefore, the cross-border banking experience is usually pretty terrible. So when you ask about new products, that's what we're looking at. Like, what are the things that people need to do cross-borders, where is kind of money becoming a constraint, or banking is not supporting it, and that's how we developed borderless. That's how we added plastic onto this as well. So you can now get a MasterCard debit card when you're traveling, and that's how it kind of makes sense, but only makes sense on kind of cross-border use cases.
That's great. Maybe switching gears a little bit and just talking about how you manage such a big, what has now become such a big company, at least very high profile, and maybe addressing some of the other smaller or earlier stage fintech companies out there. How have you managed your expansion? I mean, I think we're all familiar with the origin story of where you and TransferWise came from, and how you came up with the idea of TransferWise. But how do you manage your tech force? Where do you hire people? Do you have people centrally located in offices? How do you scale effectively?
That's a good question, and everyone who is successful or will be successful will have to handle these problems, and it's tricky. So we're maybe more global from the outset, just because we have to operate. We operate in 56 countries, and we have to, because we're moving money between these countries. We have 9 offices. We have about 1,000 and a bit more people. And it's tricky. Everyone who's probably had an engineering team in multiple locations knows that it's not easy. And I guess the trick is you have to. I mean, the benefit for us was we endured the pain where we were small. So we kind of branched out when we were still quite small, and then as we grew, we already knew what to do. That made it easier. But of course, like everyone has their own ways of getting there. I think me and Tavat, my co-founder, had the benefit of we could build a company where we would like to work, and there you can kind of take the right decisions.
That's good. I think one kind of leading from that, and part of your management style is a culture and a focus on transparency. And so a lot of what you talk about is, and including some of your advertisements around transparency and providing 100% transparency to your customers or prospective customers. And I know there's a lot of studies about the lack of transparency in the banking system. Where do you think this goes to? Where are we evolving to in terms of transparency in financial services? And is that a good thing, bad thing for the customer, and a good thing, bad thing for you as a company and some of your competitors?
I think transparency is definitely a good thing. And the reason why transparency is good, because it creates competition, or it should create competition, because if it's out in the open that banks hide their fees in the exchange rate, for example, that now we all know, it's going to get solved eventually. I mean, eventually there's going to be a regulator who comes around and says, this is not nice. You shouldn't be doing this. And until the regulators comes, people are going to be using TransferWise or anyone else who's going to be transparent. Because even if they don't mind the cost, people generally don't like to be messed around. Let's put it this way. So I think this is definitely great for consumers, and it will create better products, and more competition will create better products, not only on price but also on speed and on convenience. Open banking is a great initiative. Once we actually start using it, I'm sure it will change the landscape massively. So I do think that regulators will have a great role to play in a positive way for consumers. I wish they went a little bit faster sometimes.
Okay. One maybe switching a little bit back to products and what markets you're going after. Where are you at on consumer versus small businesses, and is small businesses still a large opportunity for you down the road?
Businesses are generally almost as poorly served as consumers. I'm sure a lot of you are operating or running a business, and you probably don't love your bank either. And especially for small businesses and freelancers, it's even worse because they get the same UI or the same user experience as a consumer does, but there are no free banking for them, so they also have to pay for it. So it's the same bad experience, but also you have to pay for it with banks. So then, and of course, businesses generally, if we think of new tech businesses that get started today, they're not going to be domestic like their bank. There's no way. If you're a tech business, you will be global, and the sooner you get global, the better it is, because if you build a product that works in Ireland, I can assure you it's probably going to work in the UK, and then it's going to work in France and everywhere else in the world. So there's no reason for you to kind of constrain it to where you started. If you're running a tech product, and then you'll need the services that support it, like we're seeing with Adyen and Stripe on the merchant side. But now, how do you manage your cash flows when they're coming in from everywhere in the world, and your expenses are everywhere in the world? Then that's where the borderless account makes a big difference, and we see a huge uptake, especially on like freelancers and small businesses. I think they're the worst served. If you're massive money mover, Citibank will bend over for you, but you'll have to be pretty big for that.
Okay. Now I'm going to get back to crypto in a weird way, just to answer the laughs that happened before, which is what other areas of fintech are you interested in? Could be crypto, could be other things.
So philosophically, crypto is super interesting. Ethereum, like a programmable blockchain, especially for me. What's kind of in more practical terms, or what's happening today? I do think that as we should be seeing interesting things happening around card payments in the future, or just merchant payments generally, because that's another area where, thanks to interchange, and it's like a pretty static dynamics in the market, that probably doesn't work as it should. If it was, if you were to design this today, you'd probably end up with something slightly different. So I do think that payments generally is going to be interesting, but it's very slow moving. So we'll probably see that play out in the next 5 years.
Okay. Any other areas?
Well, I think it's worth looking. I mean, around here, you'll see that every company that's achieved some scale, they all have a problem to solve. They're all looking at a customer problem, and as they're getting scale, it means that people want to leave their bank or provider to have that tech company solve their problem. So that's what we're doing in cross-border. Others are doing in credit and lending and savings. And I think we're all, sadly, just scratching surface still. So I think there's a long way for us to go.
Where are we? I mean, this is just a number question, but baseball, we have 9 innings. What inning of the 9 are we in terms of fintech taking over the world?
I think it's going to be coming in waves. I think a very interesting question, though, is to think of what we consider as banks today and how they will operate in 5 years' time. BPC, our new partner in France, is a great example. So they will use TransferWise for cross-border. I'm pretty sure they're going to use something else for merchant payments. And whether that means that they become a smart aggregator or just pipes or something else, I don't know yet. But it looks like the model in which the banks operate today, the universal banks traditionally, that will have to change over the next 5 years. I'm quite excited about this, and I think the main driver will be the fact that products will be global rather than local, just because the way we deal with money, we're at MoneyConf, is the same whether in Japan, in Thailand, or in the US.
Great. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for your generous answers, and thank you for the audience as well.